And we could take any example to illustrate this concept from this very Genesis. But let us use one example which we can relate to. That is whether we are well versed in scriptures or not. And that is Adam and the age of the earth. So we're going to touch on Adam and his age. But from that we shall understand, or we shall come to understand, if what we believe the age of the earth to be is correct, from what we shall see considering Adam's age, respecting which two things, from the creational account, that is that of the world, and the age of the earth, many have divided or mixed conclusions. Majority not aligning up with what scripture says, not really aligning up with the final details of what this creational account is all about. So concerning the age of the earth, let's start from the creation of Adam. And then many things we ignore shall come to light as to the correct view of the age of the earth and also Adam. So reading Genesis chapter 5, verse 3, and it says, "And Adam lived 130 years and begat a son in his own likeness after his image, and called his name Seth." When you read this statement closely, other things in the picture concerning Adam's age or him as a unique creation of God, these elements come up if you are observant, which things make the age we understand about Adam not a settled issue, because every detail in scripture matters. For an example, where else do you find that clause that someone begot a son in his own image? Because this is not a redundant addition in the passage. So we see all these things and ignore them, and yet they are singular sayings, because scripture explains scripture. It is us believers who read scripture with a preconceived idea or notion, and therefore we jump onto conclusions because of a surface reading of scripture, and therefore we come up with the things that scriptures don't say. So look closely again if this account was for mere recording of who is who, of the first fathers who inhabited the earth and their firstborns, then Abel and Cain would have been mentioned right in Genesis chapter 5 verse 3 and not Seth, because that is how language works. So no matter how a son was evil, he has to be mentioned when a genealogy of a certain man is mentioned as a record. But this is not so concerning Abel and Cain, not for the sake of it. There is a reason, a very important reason. So in a natural account without spiritual twists and implications, Seth would have been mentioned naming circumstances which made him a firstborn of Adam, because he was not, since this account of the fathers begetting other sons always starts with the firstborn. But why is Cain and Abel missed and instead Seth mentioned? Because it is important. So Seth was not the firstborn, but is mentioned as the firstborn for things we are yet to illustrate. So just as Judah was mentioned and his deceased sons that didn't make it to Egypt were mentioned, so would have been Cain and Abel in this account of Adam and his sons, or even all the fathers, the past fathers and their firstborns, because nothing else but death took away Abel and Cain, or rather Cain was alive, but in some circumstances. So even that alone could not have excluded him from being named as a son before Seth. So why is Cain and Abel not in this account? It is because of this singular reference to Adam's image and likeness that he had, and in which Seth was brought forth. So first of all, it implies that both Cain and Abel were not in this image that Seth was brought forth in, and which was not the likeness and image of God. These details matter because they reveal other circumstances of these first fathers that we simply stampede past. So it means other sons before Seth had issues that exclude them from being this image in which Seth was born in, All these details matter because remember, Moses was mighty in words. And when Moses says a son in his own image, he essentially means figures of speech, to mean a unique kind that other sons were not. So remember, Moses was mighty in words, but not in speech. So he had a knowledge, a singular or unique knowledge of figures of speech to communicate things like this, which are not very common among us, because the first existence was not like this one. Even in days of Peleg, it says that the earth was divided. That is a loaded statement, but we cannot go into details of it. But know that all these details or all these figures of speech are loaded statements for things of the old world. So Moses was mighty in words, but not in speech. So this image also forces the reader to consider Adam before and Adam with the image after he fell. So these have to be accounted for differently for purposes of why Genesis was given as a doctrine to Israel, because Israel was not chosen for the sake of bringing forth another nation. It wasn't so. So Israel was chosen for things that Adam was created for, ultimately. But things got broken along the way. That is why Adam before and his two sons, and Adam after, with this image that he conferred on Seth by birth. These two identities are shrouded in idioms or Hebraisms which escape us because we read scriptures in a hurry. A surface reading of scriptures like this drops out an incredibly surprising amount of information. So a surface reading is to read scriptures in a hurry, and we discourage that. So one crucial Hebraism we miss is that Adam became other things. The first case of this becoming was a design of God, in that Adam became a living soul. Again, here translations hid the implication of that Adam becoming a living soul, meaning that what he became was already a distinct form in existence before him, so called a living soul. This is all in Genesis. So this form that came before him and was not a human, Adam became like it when God says, and Adam became a living soul. Again, this we explain in that there were living souls created on the fifth day and on the sixth day. But translations distorted that phrase, living soul, for these statements or clauses that you see. So these are living souls but not human. Apparently, translators thought that this would mess up our understanding of what a human is, because a human was said to be a living soul. So this coming before him would mess up how we understand humans. That's my understanding of why this translation was messed up. But it could be any other reason. But the bottom line is that living souls were created before Adam, a form that Adam also became, but in another sense which was higher than them, in that he became a ruler over them, and yet these were not human. So he was a living soul, but with the image of God on him. They had similarities, these two. That is, souls coming on the sixth day, souls coming on the fifth day, but Adam had the image of God on him. So this was all missed. Now, the second case of Adam becoming things else was that he became like God. In some respects, according to that verse, became like him who made him was not a bad thing in itself, because today we are working towards becoming like him who formed us, according to 1 John chapter 3 verse 2. But for Adam becoming like God at that point in time, and yet lacking particular traits in God, was unto Adam's spiritual death. It was unto bad things. But again, this becoming escaped us as to what it implies, chief of which is that it always implies long periods of time. Long times. Even as today, the reasons for why we are changing into form are not fully manifest, and that has been for thousands of years. Or that is 2,000 years, but it is still thousands. So we are changing in form to relocate to other places and for other realities, but that has not yet manifested, and it has taken hundreds and hundreds of years. So if we miss all this, it causes a mess in our understanding of the time frame we are dealing with in the Genesis creation account. So what are we saying here? Let's read verse 3 again and you'll see it, hopefully. So Genesis chapter 5 verse 3. And Adam lived 130 years and begat a son in his own likeness after his image and called his name Seth. Now compare Genesis chapter verse 3 with verses that follow, which concern a man and the years he spent before begetting a firstborn. So let's read Genesis chapter 5 verse 6. And Seth lived 105 years and begat Enos. It means Seth was born, lived 105 years and begot Enos. Quite clear, which cannot be mistaken. So this living of a man began when that man was born until he begot a son, which is still the case today. That is the age recorded in all these verses. It cannot be improved upon to mean other things, save in distortions. So we go to Genesis chapter 5 verse 9. And Enos lived 90 years and begat Canaan. This is also clear. Peculiarly, this Enos couldn't wait longer than his father Seth. So he waited only 95 years, actually 90 years, and then we got a son. But Enos' son Canaan even waited less than the rest. He only waited for 70 years and begot a son. That is in verse 12. But Sam waited longer, of course, particularly Jared. So in Genesis chapter 5 verse 18 it reads, and Jared lived 162 years and begat Enoch. So we also have Methuselah and Lamech waited even longer before a firstborn was of interest to them. The point we are trying to make here concerns what we have believed about Adam, particularly things said of him in Genesis chapter 5, in that from the day of a man's birth to the birth of their firstborn, that is the length of time recorded of all these firstborns and first fathers, how they came into existence, whereby some of them waited shorter periods before getting a firstborn, and few, of course, waited longer periods before they got a firstborn. Now come to Adam, and we have things said between the lines which escape us entirely, because after the fall of Adam, things are said of him which we read in a hurry, and things which don't reconcile with this passage starting with Seth. So look at the age of Adam when he begat Seth, then compare that age with the rule of begetting a firstborn in all this Genesis chapter 5. To summarize it, the rule was that a man was at least 65 years old. As you see, Mahalalel and Enoch waited only 65 years before begetting a son. So because scripture says there is a time also of life, there is such a thing as a time, or there was such a thing as a time of life, outside of which it was not proper for marital affairs, meaning that not every time of the year was for marital relationships. And this rule was also hinted at when Sarah and Abraham were told that they would have Isaac. So there was hinted that they had to wait a little. Or God would have simply told them, well, go into your wife this very day that I may fulfill my promise. But he didn't with Abraham. Rather, he assured Sarah that at such a time of life, he would return and Sarah would then have a son. So why did he have to wait, or hint at them that they had to wait before he would command that a son should be born to them? Because there was such a thing, there was order in these matters as well, in that not all time was for marital affairs. So when Moses writes saying Adam lived 135 years and begot a son in his own image, how on earth can anyone walk past this, knowing there was a Cain or there was Abel to Adam before Seth? since the first fathers, starting with Adam, they all had a rule of waiting for a threshold age of at least 65 years old before begetting a first son. In that from that, at least 65 years old, one could then get a son. So you see that Jared waited for at least 165 years old to beget a firstborn. But Methuselah waited for 187. That's a long, long time. So these all waited for that much before begetting a firstborn, Lamech and Methuselah, before Noah was born. So we miss all this and simply mistake Adam's age or Adam's existence to have been on 130 because we don't pay attention to what Scripture says. So what then happened to the years of Adam when he had Cain, and Cain grew, and the years of Abel, and he grew when both became mature, own things to offer to God, and mature enough for Cain to actually want to kill Abel? What happened to those years when Adam begot Cain and Abel? Because Seth was a third son, and by the rule of begetting, there had to be at least 65 years before begetting a first son. So this is a detail which is missed, and it opens up many things concerning Adam and Cain and even Abel, things we haven't considered, because the rule or the emphasis of this chapter is a record that the age of a man he lived from his birth to that of his firstborn, that is the age recorded in Scriptures, and that is at least 65 years old. And now Seth is not even his second son, but the third, and yet that by the time other sons came after the first son, the fathers were already in hundreds of years. Remember, Seth was the third son of Adam. So did the first fathers follow this pattern to have their firstborns in the image of Adam. So some had first sons after a few years, that being 65 years, and the oldest having a son at 187 years before he had a firstborn. So we miss all this. Therefore, you see that Noah at 500 years had only 3 sons. So this rule of waiting is reflected in the number of the sons of Noah, in that even at 600 years old, Noah still had only 3 sons, since it is written himself and his immediate sons and their wives were the 8 souls to enter the ark. Moreover, by the space of 400 years at least, years of Noah, in which he had these 3 sons, even themselves had no children as yet. In between that 400 years, none of these had a son, still waited according to that rule. In that at 600 years of Noah, none of his sons had a son as yet, until after the 600th year. And yet his sons had wives within these years, but without a son. Think about that. So we therefore cannot take liberty to work around this stark reality in the language given here concerning Adam, who had already 3 sons and yet only given an age of 135. That is very inconsistent with the narrative in chapter 5. So these verses then indicate to us that this is not a mere record as in other scriptures, because emphasis is placed on the fact that Adam begot in his own image. That is like a padlock of sorts which opens a door, just as when he was created, because Scripture emphasized that they were created in someone else's image, who was God. So these things said between the lines but not plainly put is why Moses was said to be mighty in words, not in speech but mighty in words. So the very things or figures in Revelation in that Dan was also omitted in Revelation, which naturally doesn't make sense, because in natural records, this is not how language works when it is a natural account. No matter how wicked or offending a son might have been in his life before death, he cannot be omitted when recording a genealogy. He has to be mentioned in the genealogy. But in figures of speech, they are the ones with the way with language to omit or to defy language to make a point. So it is in figures and metaphors that have liberty to modify language to make a point, even though language rules are defied or broken in the process. So this is the idea behind Adam's being 130 years, which defies the rule or the emphasis laid in Genesis chapter 5. Then those who insist on a physical reading deriving the earth's age being only 6,000 years or 7,000 years, or whatever they calculate the age of creation to be, because of Adam's age or just any other factor. How do you account for Adam having 3 sons and is only 135 years old against the narrative of chapter 5? Because if you compare Noah, who had 3 sons already, was already 600 years old, and his sons, having had wives for at least 100 years each, they had no sons, because this was a rule among these first fathers who inhabited the earth. So this is what we miss with Adam's age, and therefore confuse the age of the entire creation. What do you do with this gap? That Abel, a second son, even lived to an age when he owned flocks, let alone a first son who lived before Abel, before the 135 years mentioned in Genesis. Very inconsistent. So scripture cannot be broken, but our understanding can. If someone insists saying, well, Cain and Abel were within the 135 years old, I can grant you that it is also logical if taken in isolation. That is out of context. But read context and it constrains you to be logically consistent, because the rule is that a man had to be at least 65 years old before begetting a son. So if Cain and Abel and Seth were all born to Adam within the 135 years, it would be inconsistent with the narrative in Genesis chapter 5. Clearly there was an unwritten law that they had to live a certain age before the first man begot his firstborn. That is why at the first mention of Noah as a mature man, this Noah was already 500 years old, but had only 3 sons, which affirms the rule of waiting to get a first son. So it shows that Noah waited at least 100 years for each son to be begotten. And as you see that Noah's sons, first mentioned, they had wives 100 years later at 600 years of Noah. His sons still had no son. But Adam at 135 years had already 3 sons, 2 of which sons were omitted in the picture, and of whom one was a seed. So the omission is not redundant because it matters, being information in its own right, something you could say we're reading between the lines, because these are figures of speech. And that is how language in figures works, because all details are not given. You're meant to understand what literal meaning can be derived from a statement that you're looking at. So it means our derived age of the earth is also far-fetched, because we read scriptures as though it is a newspaper, and it's not. It's not plain. So Adam had another image, which then made him unique in the time he had that image and likeness of God. That time is not accounted for, and yet it made him drastically distinct in his nature and environment from the Adam of the time he had another image called his own image, which he conferred on Seth, because he was cast into another environment. So that's what escapes us, but with a very heavy impact on our understanding of this Genesis creation account. So if it was just about a record of genealogies and begetting, then Cain and Abel would have been included, even as it happened to Judah, in that even though he lost his 2 sons, but in his lineage they are still mentioned. That is how genealogies work, or records of them. But in Genesis, it's not so, because it must take into account what Adam was formerly and what also he became, because these 2 realities are different, and therefore his sons like him who come after him during his fall. So what he became is reflected in the clause begot a son in his own image. Therefore, the former sons are not in the picture for that very reason, because the realities of the old world, not plainly written but transmitted, are all important to account for. So they are transmitted deliberately, omitting them in some way, but leaving the gaps, saying things that we have to account for. Transmitted by deliberately omitting names that shouldn't be omitted. Again, because of what Moses was in that he was mighty in language, in figures of speech, even though he wasn't a good speaker. So same things that happened to Dan's tribe in the book of Revelation, in that it was missed concerning millennial realities of children of Israel. So Dan was missed because of what Dan signifies in millennial realities. That is what isolates Seth by these 135 years. Now you want to ask, what image was Abel, since he was a seed, even as Seth is the seed that replaced Abel? Because I know some smart one out there may say, hey, Cain is not mentioned because Cain was the seed of the serpent, and therefore he's not recorded in the genealogy. I can't go into disputes here, but if it is so that Cain was omitted, yet what would you say was the image of Abel that got him out of the record, since Seth replaced Abel as a seed? So if Abel had the image of Seth, or the image of Adam after the fall, then Abel would have been mentioned, because Abel also was a seed. So why is Abel missed as a seed that was replaced by Seth? If Seth was a seed as Abel was a seed, why does it say Adam lived 135 years and begot in his own image, in a characteristic way that makes Seth the first of that kind with that image? We miss all this because Genesis chapter 5 verse 3 limits Adam's begetting in that image to Seth, even though Abel is also said to be a seed, though we are not descended from him. So if it had not limited that image to Seth alone, then it would be a natural thing to assume that all these three sons were his image, were in his image. But that is not written. Only Seth had the image that Adam had after 135 years old, the image which we also inherit. That is why 135 years old isolates Seth, but which 135 years old we assume was the age of Adam's whole existence before Seth was born. And therefore it is grossly misleading, a misleading approach which majority derive.